Jerusalem Corona Diary. I'm teaching a graduate seminar on John Milton, which is a great, great pleasure. And it's a particular pleasure because we get to read Milton now. People can argue who is better, Shakespeare or Milton, and the people who say Shakespeare are right. But there's something about Milton which makes him extraordinary to be reading right now. Where Shakespeare, you have no idea what his personality is, what he thinks. I mean, there's no normative character in any of his plays which express the Shakespearean perspective. Where you never hear Shakespeare's voice, all you do is hear Milton's voice. Meaning Milton is really perfecting the ways in which we can conceive about individualism and free will. Milton gets on people's nerves because he has such chutzpah, because he pushes the limits of self-fashioning and making himself as an individual. But why it's inspiring to read Milton now, and we get to say that. 2 months ago, we didn't get to say that because you don't really get to say, you're not allowed to say that you're actually inspired by literature. You're allowed to critique literature, but you can't be inspired by it. Guess what? You can be inspired by literature. And what's inspiring about Milton is that he felt the imperative to engage with the particular moment in which he lived. When he was called back, he was hanging around on his tiul after the army. I'm just kidding. He was on his post-education trip to Italy. He was meeting with Galileo. He was enjoying the humanist courts. He gets called back to England. Why? For the cause of revolution. He makes himself present to the moment. Throughout his life, in his poetry and his prose, he looked at the historical moment as calling him. When he writes an epic poem about God and saints and angels and devils, he's actually, the other side of his chutzpah is a steep, deep sense of skepticism about the ability that he himself might have to tell this story in such a way that doesn't do violence to the actual story. Meaning Milton for himself would have skepticism about anything that would claim to be actual. Everything is always a representation. And representations for Milton, if you give an image of Satan, well, is that really what Satan is? All the more so. If you give an image of God, if you represent God, is that really what God is? Will your readers misread this to think that's what God is? Milton, like many Renaissance poets, was aware primarily, among many, many things, of the very strong possibility of being misread. And almost every Renaissance text is really about reading. And Milton's emphasis is learn how to read. And even though he feels that skepticism, he feels the imperative. I must write this. Because people need teachers and people need leaders. And the moment is calling me. The moment for Milton in Paradise Lost was a lost revolution, the idea of just the loss from the Garden of Eden. The first 5 lines of Paradise Lost repeat mortality, death, woe, loss, because that's the moment that Milton is in. But in this moment of loss, in this moment of crisis, in this moment of plague, he makes himself present. He becomes a leader. He engages with the world. Part of the problem, of course, in Israel these days is the leaders who are meant to engage with the world simply have not. They've had generations, maybe centuries, of not needing to engage with the world. In fact, for them in exile, the highest value was studying within the 4 walls of the Beit Midrash. That was the real realm, not only of thought, but of action. Not only thought, but of action. So when the state of Israel, for example, gets formed in 48, most of the rabbis from the stream, they just don't know what to do because they have no experience with facing reality. And this reality for many just comes as a complete and, for everybody, a complete and utter shock, but it's one they cannot recover from. They can't recover from the shock. So also with Corona, we are always ready for the crisis we faced last week, and we may kind of be ready for the crisis we're facing today, maybe, but there's no way we're ready or even getting ready or thinking about the crisis for next week. And part of that is because people, and the rabbis especially, don't want to face what it means. Because everybody is in denial. Nobody wants to face the fact that we are living through a world historical crisis. And when people write about this in the future, they will write about it in the same way they wrote about the Twin Towers. I think in the same way that they wrote about some of the wars that America went through, that this is going to be a defining moment for many people because of its gravitude, because of its gravity. And being able to see that gravity is what's required of a good leader. But people don't want to see. People on beaches in Florida didn't want to see. People in the communities here don't want to see. I'm sure you have people in your families that don't want to see. There are people who want to cut corners. Seeing things we don't want to see is problematic. I was looking at a passage from Ta'anit, which is a tractate about what happens when bad things happen to Jewish communities, usually lack of rainfall, drought, but also plagues. And there's an argument between two sages. They agree that in a city which is suffering plague, you both fast and you call out. You call out, that calling out, and maybe that should come first, is the calling out of the shofar. And after the call of the shofar, then there's that addition. Although simultaneous, that's just how I'm suggesting we understand it, there's that addition of fasting. Now, if it's an adjacent city, it's not your city, it's next door, right? And what should you do then? So one of the sages says, fast and don't call out. The other says, call out and don't fast. Fast and don't call out. Well, I should just say there's a commentator from the 12th or 13th century, Rabbeinu Nissim, he's known as the Ron, and he says that you should look at this argument as an argument between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. That is, Rabbi Akiva, who says, call out, and it's with the shofar, and don't fast, that's the Rosh Hashanah perspective. The other sage says, you fast, and you don't call out. Meaning, I think the other sage is suggesting we understand the gravity of this. And because we understand that gravity, we are going to take this upon ourselves. I think Rabbi Akiva is more skeptical and to me more interesting, because Rabbi Akiva says you can't fast unless you know what you're fasting about. And unless you look at the world and you feel it, again, this is the neighboring town. Unless you look at the world and you feel it, you will avoid it, because we will do anything we can to avoid the possibility of having to look at tragedy. People knew about this virus in January. People knew about it. And leaders decided we have to have Mardi Gras. We have to have Purim. We can't not have those things. Other leaders did worse things. So Rabbi Akiva says, before you even think about getting to that point of fasting, call out with the shofar, rouse yourself, see the world, engage with the world, make yourself present to the world. Be a leader. Doesn't have to be for 10,000 people. Doesn't have to be for 35 people in a classroom. It could be for your family. Help them see, make them see. That's the coronavirus diary from Jerusalem.